It's one of the biggest window pistol optics on the market, and immediately you either are intrigued by it or hate it based on how it looks. Either way, it's going to get dropped in slow motion, and it is the Cyelee Bull Pro. Welcome back to the Humble Marksman channel. I'm David, and these are the Cyelee Bull Pros. So I do want to go ahead and disclose that these are media samples that were sent to me, and the way we kind of got there is we've been making optics in China for a really long time from major brands like Holosun and Vortex. All of those are Chinese-made pistol optics, and I assumed that on a long enough time scale, the lesser-known brands were going to draw level in quality. So earlier this year, I got curious and agreed to have a sample sent to me on the Cap Pro. As it turns out, the Cap Pro was an amazing optic, so when they mentioned that they were getting into the competition space, I said I would be very interested in checking out their sites. Now, some of you guys are immediately offended by the look of the pistol optic because an entire family of hummingbirds could take shelter in the cowl of this huge optic. But what that massive optic allows you to do, and for those of you who don't shoot dynamically, but you just go to the range and you print, shots at a slow fire cadence on a target at like 7 yards away. But when you're actually shooting dynamically, what happens is you get a little bit of almost like tunnel vision to where the entire world drops away and you just have this little glowing orb and the targets that you're focused on. Your peripheral vision is still kind of there, but your world does get about this big, which happens to be roughly the same size as the window of this optic. The window is absolutely massive. Here's a side-by-side with the SRO and a side-by-side with a Delta Point Pro, a side-by-side with the Romeo 3 Max, and a side-by-side with the Holosun 507 Comp. The one thing that this optic has that most of those other optics don't have is a really low deck height, which is a feature in an optic that I now appreciate on a much deeper level. When SIG released the Romeo X optics in their Romeo M17 optic, I got to experience the lowest deck height on an optic available, and it makes the window size not matter as much because you don't lose the dot as much. It's easy to find because it's right there on top of your bore. The Bull drops that deck height on a big windowed optic down lower than anything else on the market. If you look at it next to this SRO, the SRO appears much higher when I adjust for the elevation. That kind of helps the performance that the big window sort of suggests. And it's not all upside. There's some negatives and stuff. We'll get into that at the end of the video because you can't have a window this monstrous without having a price to pay, and you certainly pay it. But first, let's look at the drop test. So I mounted it on this Voodoo Priest, and I dropped it onto AR-500 steel from shoulder height, and you can see the ding to the hood it took right there. What was very interesting about it is the glass is completely intact, so that means that these crazy looking bezels absolutely do their job and protect the glass. You can't hit the glass any kind of way because it is completely protected. Now, the cost of that is that the lens has to come forward quite a bit and cantilever forward. On this Voodoo Priest, you can see that it actually overhangs the breech face just a little bit, but not enough to cause reliability, but enough for the window to get smoked with the gas that comes out of the chamber, and there's a little bit of carbon buildup down at the bottom of the shroud. So the dot did not break when I dropped it. The zero did shift about 3 inches to the right. If you look at where it hit on the optic, which is on the left, the whole optic kind of shifted, and then I was able to re-zero it. And then I took it and shot a match, and it was absolutely fine. The one thing I did have happen is that the shock to the optic coupled with shooting a match allowed the Loctite to break, and I had to re-clean the screws and put them back in place, but now it's good to go. Similar story on the Walther PDP steel frame match that we have here. The cut is much further back, so it doesn't even come close to the breech face, and as a result, there is no carbon that's deposited on the lens of this optic. It's a really good setup for this type of pistol. The optic reticles, unfortunately, are not what I would want as a competition shooter. They have a 3 MOA, which is the standard Bull Pro, and then if you get the X Pro, that is their multi-reticle system, which is what I have. It's a 2 MOA dot with a 24 MOA ring. Now, the 2 and 24 sight picture is better, I would say, than probably just the 3, because you can use that 24 MOA ring to be kind of like a massive dot when you're shooting close range about 10 yards and in, and then when you're focusing on mini poppers and stuff like that, you can just draw your attention to the main dot. It was an adjustment that I kind of picked up on when I was shooting this gun in a US PSA match, and just was immediately amazed, like, huh, I'm accommodating the big circle on the close stuff, and I'm using the small dot at far away. It was not something I chose to do, I just kind of figured it out. I would still prefer a 6 MOA, 8 MOA, maybe even a 10 MOA version that's just the dot. The brightness is very high, so if you step up the illumination a lot, you'll probably see some like junk, some artifacts projecting onto the screen. I don't know how they masked the emitter or whatever it is that they did, but if you go nuclear with the sight way more than the ambient lighting suggests, then it's a pretty messy sight. But generally speaking, the reticle is very, very clean with an astigmatism that I have. Now, the one thing about this is it's not an aspherical lens, which means that you get a fisheye effect around the edge. And so if I kind of swirl the optic around, there is noticeable distortion on whatever it is you happen to be looking at. There is a slight blue-green notch filter that does discolor your whites, but it doesn't like torch colors quite like an RMR does, but it is observable. That kind of stuff is pretty standard. I don't get too upset about it. I found that generally just having the bigger window made amends for all of those shortcomings that you might say. The other thing is the turrets to adjust elevation and windage. They do have an audible click, but they do not have a tactile click. And the audible click is super quiet. So you're gonna have to be sitting at the range with your hearing pro off. So if you're in a noisy range environment, you're not gonna be able to hear the clicks at all. When I zeroed the optic, I definitely used the tick marks on the turrets to understand what elevation I was putting in. From a value perspective, these are very affordable sights. The X Pro with the multi-reticle system is selling for just south of 300 bucks. And the 3 MOA dot sells for just $250. So that is a very good value. Now, as far as negatives are concerned, I recommended this to a number of my buddies who picked them up. Most of them really liked it. One of my buddies didn't like it and ended up returning it because his shooting buddy got it and they just didn't like it. I'm not gonna keep him safe. It was Kenny and his shooting buddy was his dad. But they didn't like the distortion of the window. They didn't like the reticle. They didn't like the fact that you have to modify your holster to get the gun to go in. Now, modifying the holster is a real concern if you're using like a traditional Kydex style holster like the CompTac International that I used for the PDP. I definitely had to notch out of the holster to get the pistol to seat all the way in and cover the trigger guard. With the Voodoo Gunworks, I just used the Ghost Hydra P, which is honestly a great holster. And if you use the code GEARUP10 at Ghost Holster Direct, you can save 10% on an awesome holster. The Hydra P did not have any problems in allowing me to holster my Hummingbird Sanctuary, and I had a great match. I won limited optics and was second overall in the match. But your mileage may vary depending on the type of holster you're using. The other thing to consider is that this optic single-handedly, like just look at it from the bottom, guys. It's absolutely massive. It is wider than the IDPA box. You cannot use this sight in IDPA legally, which is a shame because that's where I used this sight on this pistol. So while the sight is pretty awesome, it's just a little bit too big for the IDPA world. The battery is a 1632 accessed from a door that you have to unscrew to open on the right side of the optic. So once it's on the pistol, you don't have to take it off to change batteries. So that's the Cyelee Bull Pro. I think it's a really cool optic. Probably not gonna take it off this Voodoo Gunworks Priest. Eventually, Walter's gonna make me send back this PDP match, in which case I will be taking it off it, but I kinda like it. So I think it's a pretty solid optic. If it breaks or anything like that, I'll be sure to let you guys know in a future video, but round count's pretty high on them. I mean, this one is probably pushing close to 1,000 rounds. Whereas this one is probably just sub 500 rounds, but I haven't had any issues at all. If you've got questions, sound off in the comments below. As always, I appreciate you guys, and I'll catch you on the next one.